Well, with more on the environmental concerns about the MOU signed last week, we're now joined by David Miller. From 2003 to 2010, Mr. Miller was the mayor of Toronto. He now co-chairs Elbows Up for Climate, which is a group of municipal leaders advocating for national projects and policies that have climate in mind. David Miller, good to see you again.
It's very good to see you, and thanks for having me on the show.
Happy to have you here. And I should also note that you're also the managing director of the C40 Centre, which is a global network of mayors who work for climate action on the municipal level. So obviously you have the green credentials when we start this conversation. And to that, in regards to the Elbows Up for Climate, your organization did release a statement on the MOU last week. You say in part the following: "It is deeply troubling that the Prime Minister has chosen to prioritize the subsidization of fossil fuel projects to benefit some of the world's richest companies and increase their vast profits at the expense of our communities." I will say that is not the argument that you'll hear from the Prime Minister. He says nothing about making rich companies richer. For him, this is about getting a Canadian product to market. Quite frankly, the only product that Canada has that the world truly wants at a time when Canadian exports to the United States are at their lowest level in decades. Are you ignoring the economic reality that this country faces by speaking out against this MOU?
It's a very fair question. The answer to that is no, we're doing exactly the opposite. The coalition I co-chair with Mayor Valerie Plante represents municipal leaders, often from cities and towns across Canada, who've already faced climate disasters, like Jasper, for example, which had over 30% of its buildings burn literally overnight. I mean, it's an extraordinary impact on the people of that city, the businesses, and the economy. And what we're saying is federal funding shouldn't subsidize making that problem worse, which this deal and the associated changes to methane regulations, for example, will. It'll make climate change worse and will do less to help solve the problem. Instead, we should think about building an economy in this country that works for people and is clean. And we've proposed 5 nation-building projects like a national energy grid. Canada's a big supplier of clean electricity, but it's easier for us to sell it to the US than it is for BC to sell it to Alberta, for example. We could create a clean energy grid across this country. We could create a rapid train network supplemented by electric buses. We could build 2 million units of housing that are needed, and I'm here in Ottawa for the Canadian Urban Institute conference about housing, and build them using sustainable materials, sustainable methods, sustainable strategies, solving 2 problems at once. We can retrofit the housing we have, and the federal government could fund a national resilience strategy. What happens when you have to evacuate a place like Jasper on no notice, virtually no notice? What happens? How do you fund the recovery? It's not just about insurance. What's the federal role in helping people prepare? Jasper was actually quite prepared, but what's the federal role there? And those kinds of projects are a better choice for federal spending, create more jobs, and help our cities and towns adapt.
Jobs, because ultimately though, what the Prime Minister is trying to do here with these major projects is to have, and this is his words, to have this catalytic effect in that, for example, with pipelines, there's no pipeline yet, but by dropping regulations, he is trying to encourage private investment to put money forward, which would then catalyze other investment on associated things like concrete, steel. How do the projects you talk about, what type of economic impact will it have to encourage other investment in this country? Because ultimately that it has been a long-standing problem for Canada.
Well, if you think about building a national electricity grid, right? Our system is provincial. Think about the steel and aluminum that's involved in that, the construction jobs, good union jobs, by the way, well-paid union jobs all across this country. If you think about doing the work that's necessary to do energy retrofits on buildings to lessen their use of fossil fuels, lower our impact on the planet, that's tens, if not hundreds of thousands of good, well-trained, skilled trades, likely union jobs.
But it sounds like public money, though, not private investment, and that's ultimately what they're trying to move here.
Can be lots of private investment here, particularly around buildings, but there is huge public subsidies going to the oil companies here. It's a little bit hidden, but through the Pathways project, the project that's going to sequester carbon, and then, by the way, going to reuse it to exploit more oil, which is a really negative thing, and it's why Elizabeth May won't support this, despite promises from the Prime Minister. But there are huge public subsidies involved in that. Our argument is repurpose that money to help build the infrastructure that Canada needs, that people have been talking about for at least a decade, about a national clean grid, about a building retrofit strategy, about building the new homes that the government is already funding in a sustainable way. That's a far more successful use for the economy in the long run of scarce public funds than using them to subsidize the oil companies, most of which are big multinationals and have a lot of money.
How does that, though, address the challenge of exports? Because, again, we are now at this lowest level of exports to the United States in decades as a result of what's happening with Donald Trump. And add to that the stated goal of this government to double our exports to countries beyond the United States. I hear that the projects that you were naming here, but they ultimately are domestic products, not about getting the world to buy Canadian.
So 3 comments on that. Okay. First of all, if you're talking about exporting oil products, we already have a pipeline to the coast that the federal government built at great expense to public funds, and its capacity can be expanded easily and inexpensively and not have the really serious potential environmental risk of a pipeline of diluted bitumen going through the Great Bear Rainforest, pristine rainforest, and past some of the most important fishing grounds in the world, which will be destroyed if there's an accident. That's the risk they're taking. So we're already doing that. If you look at the kinds of projects we're talking about, yes, they're made in Canada. They use Canadian materials, Canadian jobs. But, you know, when the U.S. first put the tariffs on, one of the reasons we didn't go into as bad a recession as economists thought was because people were buying Canadian. So there's merit to that. The third thing is, you know, one of the areas we're losing in exports that's really critical, people aren't talking about, is advanced manufacturing, including cars. The tariffs have really, really hurt there. And there's a way to use domestic procurement policies of the governments, selected partnerships with the right companies to push back against that and really increase our advanced manufacturing. For example, Bombardier's discussions with Saab about building jets instead of buying American ones. Those kinds of things can help ensure that we can trade with others. It's not just about natural resources. And in Ontario, may not feel like in Ottawa, but certainly in and around Toronto, that advanced manufacturing is the backbone of our economy. And we really need to make sure it succeeds.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're talking to someone who lived in Oshawa, so I hear what you're saying about that.
You know very well indeed.
But, you know, but still, I don't know if that solves the export problem, nor does it, for example, inspire international investors. You mentioned Saab, but where else does that come from? Because at the end of the day, if you can get the oil to Asia, there is a demand in Asia. And at the end of the day, when you look at the Great Recession back in 2007 to 2009, Canada did not suffer as much as other countries, in part because of our oil exports, which the world wanted and quite frankly still wants.
Well, I would push back on that quite a bit. I mean, I work for an international coalition of mayors of the world's biggest cities, and if you look at what's going on in the world now, it's moving to clean energy at a rapid pace because it's so cheap. And, you know, if you're going to have an agreement with Alberta around something like this, at a minimum, they should be allowing their clean energy. They have massive potential capacity, which the provincial government stopped. And if you look, Abacus had an interesting poll this summer in June, in which 2/3 of Canadians said, we prefer clean energy to conventional oil. And that's where the world is going. And yes, could Canada sell some products in the short term? Possibly. But a pipeline like you're talking about is going to take a decade or more to build. And China is changing. It's doing incredible things in clean energy. Yes, it still has dirty energy. Africa is changing. Latin America is changing. Canada needs to be part of that movement. And if it was, we'd create a different kind of economy, but one that has a very strong made in Canada component with lots of jobs. And that's what the mayors are arguing. You know, they're not just saying protect our cities and towns. They're saying we suffered from climate change. We suffered from wildfires. It's time for us to act and build a different kind of economy that helps solve the problem, not make it worse.
David Miller, always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thanks for having me on.